They knew what the fuck they were doing. They were like, I don't care if I gotta fake this shit, you aren't fucking selling my ass.
No such thing as a life that's better than yours. Love yours. Thing as a life that's better than yours. No such thing, no such thing.
Ciao everyone, welcome or welcome back. And in today's video, it's gonna be as per usual, not even controversial, just educational. How about that? In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how being deaf during slavery was actually an advantage. Such a weird, crazy topic, I know, but I did write a whole research paper on this for my last paper for my Slavery in the Making of America class. And I just thought that this would be a really interesting topic to talk about, not only because I'm transferring schools to become an interpreter and also within, you know, ASL, but also because I was an Afro major plus history. So these topics kind of all merging together is just so interesting to me. And I want more people to know about the deaf community and what it was like. And so y'all are gonna hear me talking about them a lot. So just prepare to be sick of me. Thank you. So like I said, I used to go to the University of Minnesota and I was a double major in African American and African Studies and also history. But because of my love for ASL, I decided to transfer schools and I am now double majoring again in ASL and Deaf Communities and Interpreting. So those are kind of my qualifications. Don't come for me. One thing I do have to say is disability studies is still fairly new. So a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about was very hard to find. I had to go on to like Gallaudet and like their J store. For the people who know, you know, I had to go on there. I had to go into the depths of everything. So bear with me if there's not too much information on this, but I did try to kind of make people think on what was it like to be disabled during slavery at a time where slaves were already used so much as a commodity and being able to do the most for your master was the most important. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how Black women who had these disabled children had to deal with that, what they would do, how it was essentially an advantage even though it was during slavery. I know, and I know it sounds crazy, and yes, there's never really any advantages I guess during slavery, but this is kind of one of them. And really just like I guess talking more about disability and how it affected people back then. Not only am I talking about disabled people, but I'm also talking about deaf people. I know a lot of the times deaf people don't want to be labeled as disabled, so that is just what I mean when I'm talking about deaf people and disabled people during slavery. Okay, I probably will definitely specify like who I'm talking about. When I say disability studies, I mean in the sense of a lot of the times nobody really focused on people who were disabled, people who were deaf, people who were blind. Back then, nobody really focused on them. So that's why it's like when I say disability studies is still fairly new, it's very hard to find information when it comes to this information. Without further ado, let's get started. So basically what my thesis is disabled slaves, more specifically deaf slaves, were able to kind of get away with a lot more things and also have advantages during this time that was often looked at as such a negative time period, which it is. But during this time, at least having kind of like those advantages from the disadvantages that you had within yourself, that ultimately like allowed you to get away with a couple things. I will say that. I'm going to be talking about that. Let me stop rambling. Of course, Black women, Black slaves. I think a lot of the times when I think of just how strong Black women is, I have to think of slavery. Not only were we doing a lot of stuff, we were being raped, we were being sexualized, we were forced to do so many things, and at the same time never complain, never be able to, you know, just withstand everything basically. During this time when family separation was at an all-time high, at least for Black mothers who had children that were disabled or deaf, they kind of had an advantage because of the way that slaves were looked at as a commodity back then. A disabled slave slash slave child wouldn't really be able to do a lot for other people who aren't being taught by their mother themselves. I don't know if that makes sense. Let me try to re-explain it. So basically, if you have a disabled child and you have the mother on the same plantation, there would be no reason to sell that child and take him away or take them away from their mother and then stick them in another plantation where nobody knows anything about the disability. Instead, you can just put that responsibility on the mother and be like, hey, you can take care of your child and they can stay on this plantation, but you're still gonna get everything you need to get done regardless of the fact. So basically, I'm gonna be reading a lot of the quotes that are referencing from the scholarly journals and all the other sources that I have, just because they basically stick the exact exact point on what I'm trying to say. When talking about Black mothers and how they had to do everything and have a disabled child at the same time, this is what they said. Whether they were born or became disabled, enslaved children with disabilities were ubiquitous presence on the antebellum plantation. Their mothers, already beleaguered by the barrage of labor demands, with their parental role forcibly subordinated to the economic interests of slaveholders, confronted even greater obstacles in meeting their disabled child's needs and protecting them from an institution that objectified and devalued them. Oof. Thank you. So, of course, during this time, it was very, in a way, hard for Black women to not only have to take care of their disabled children at the same time, but also to still be expected to do everything while still trying to care for their disabled child who ultimately has a lot of needs. So I can only imagine during slavery when you're already not getting any resources and you have a disabled child, whether they have autism, whether they are deaf, blind, you know, in those types of, I guess, that sphere, I just want to know how hard it was back then. I guess another advantage that can be looked at during this time is because of these children having disabilities, they were never really separated from their mothers, like I explained earlier. Because of the such unique bond that these disabled children would have with their mothers, it ultimately made no sense to even threaten separating y'all because it wouldn't make sense. Again, as I'll talk about it later in the video, slaves were looked at as a commodity. Everything mattered as to how they were going to be valued at the market. If you were missing a limb, an eye, or had some type of deformity, you were already devalued. So imagine if you have a disability, you're going to be devalued even more because it's what can you really add to the plantation. That is why a lot of the times slave masters had to just say fuck it, okay, and buy the mother and the child because you really can't separate the child from their mother. So another quote explaining this would be, this combination of ideas rendered this young man especially worthless from a labor standpoint, while his mother's visible concern for him further heightened the sense that he could not care for himself, let alone productively labor for another's profit. This is basically saying it would make absolutely no sense for her disabled son to go on to the market and to be sold because he can't even take care of himself. How is he supposed to provide profit to a slave master? When you really think of these things, it's like, damn, I never thought of it like that. But it's like, that's what I'm saying. It's like things that are so intertwined and so complicated. Nobody really thinks about this, but that is why I think I speak so heavily when it comes to the deaf community, is because they have a whole history that is so undiscovered and so not appreciated that shit. Anything that I find interesting, I'm gonna talk about it. And I found this especially interesting, and I knew that with being at the U, I wanted my final research paper or my senior paper, I wanted it to be about deaf slaves, but now that I'm switching, I won't have to write about it. I can just talk about it. Also, with this perspective in mind, slave masters have never really been the one to cater to a slave, but in this case, they had to. If you really want the mom who picks 80 pounds of cotton in a day, you're gonna have to take the child with her. Because at the end of the day, that child would be sold for close to nothing because of already how they were looked at as being valueless. So just reading like another thing where it says, with this perspective in mind, slave masters are forced to abide by the needs of special needs children because at the end of the day, their mother was one of the few people that could care for them properly and still get the work done that needed to be done. If they didn't have their mother showing them how to do everything or even certain tasks to not be considered completely useless or ubiquitous as stated earlier. It can be seen as an advantage because especially during slavery when family separation was at an all-time high, having a disability would be able to allow you to stay with your mother, but that always didn't stand for when it came to other siblings or other people who weren't disabled. If you weren't disabled, you were just looked at as another slave and casted off like the rest of them, but having a disability forced slaves, having a disability almost forced slave masters to have some type of compassion and empathy towards the disabled slave. So like I talked about earlier, and devaluing them and how having a deformity of some type of sort could automatically devalue by a lot. Slave masters knew this and also slaves knew this. After a tense round of back and forth bidding with the trader, Brown secured the purchase of this young deaf man for $330, considerably less than the average price of a prime slave of his age, so that he could remain with his anxious, protective mother. His younger, non-disabled sister, however, did not fare as well and was struck off to Judge Sturgis of Georgia for an undisclosed amount. This can basically show how even when you don't have a disability, you're, like I said, you're casted off, you're looked at as every other slave. But because he was deaf and because he really needed his mother to communicate and to be able to even do anything, the slave master was willing to buy him at a considerably lower price, even though he's in his prime. prime. And I think that's what a lot of people fail to realize, is age was such a big thing during slavery. If you were not in your prime, again, you were casted off with like the elders, the disabled, not being able to do anything like that, and ultimately looked at as just a waste of space. I'm not saying that because I don't believe that, but that's what, especially, I'm like, y'all gotta realize the things that I say are not crazy, because if I'm doing my research paper and this is what they were saying back then, could you only imagine what was not put in the research articles and papers? Exactly. A slave in his prime age being bought for considerably less. Who wants to do that? No one. But the slave master did it anyways so he could stay with his mother. And that is what I'm saying, like with some of these advantages on being disabled during slavery was an advantage, because if I cannot do the work for you, or I need my mother to communicate with me in some type of way, you can't sell me and you can't sell her. You gotta sell us together. And this is exactly what I'm saying, is this particular sale sharply illustrates how and why disability sometimes worked in enslaved families' favors. This young man's deafness elicited pity from his deceased owner's family, who stood in to purchase him on behalf of his mother. Hello, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Another advantage that could be looked at as well is the uncomfortability that people have with people with disabilities. I've seen it time and time again, even at a restaurant, or even just like in out and about doing nothing. When someone with a disability is in the vicinity, there are some people who are visibly uncomfortable. I don't know why. They're literally just people that are different, but I digress. So with saying this is, especially back then when so many things are taboo, so many things are just looked at differently, you could kind of have a power dynamic when it comes to slaves and slave masters, because at the end of the day, slave masters are the ones who have to accommodate to deaf slaves. So like I said, another advantage that is often overlooked is the uncomfortability when it came to dealing with slaves of any type of disabilities, and the power dynamic that was used in order to achieve certain things around the plantation or even off the plantation. And this was definitely used to their advantage, because in the quote it says, his successful ruse of being deaf and dumb, and by association valueless, is a telling example of the power that slaves had to perform disabilities in the antebellum Southern society. Furthering on that, a diagnosis of disability could also allow a slave to avoid punishment for crimes, and more frequently to halt undesired sales. Evidence of a disability, even an obviously counterfeit one, could lower the prospective values and even terminate dealings with prospective buyers, a phenomenon well known to many slaves. They knew what the fuck they were doing. They were like, I don't care if I gotta fake this shit, you aren't fucking selling my ass. And also during my research as well, I found that there was this one specific thing that I read that was basically saying that he pretended to be deaf, and a white mom, and they were about to do things to him and he just pretended to be deaf. They like backed off and they just allowed him to, you know, go back to his plantation or whatever. And that is exactly what I'm talking about. These certain advantages of, like I said, the uncomfortability of people dealing with disabilities or deaf people, especially back then, was an advantage. You could get away with a lot of shit. And with the last quote that I want to talk about is, disabled slaves tested the strengths of the invisible cords of sympathy. And by saying that, looking back, slave masters were very ruthless. They didn't give a fuck. They would literally kill your ass if they wanted to, because they owned you. Black people and slaves were looked at as property back then, not human beings. I don't know if y'all don't understand the 3/5 rule. This isn't anything new. Why did I want to make this video? I wanted to make this video to not only talk about deaf history, deaf black history, but also to show that there's some really fucking cool things within deaf history. And I have always said it, I just have a passion for the deaf community, ASL, and that is why I'm becoming an interpreter, just to, you know, fully be engulfed in it. Learning this knowledge and really finding out more about the black deaf community. That specifically my focus is the black deaf community. I don't hear shit about them. I don't hear, like, so it's so hard to like really try to be in a community when your community is even more undiscovered, right? So I just want to shed light onto the deaf community, deaf history. I'm about that big, okay? I'm not playing around. Y'all know me. I love to ramble. I love to do these little sit down chit chat sessions with y'all. And yeah, so I hope y'all enjoyed this video, and I'll see y'all in my next one. Bye, y'all.